perspective. So she's often using creative practice methods, as well as community economies and frameworks, as well as close textual analysis. So her most recent publication is Modes of Thermoregulation, which was published in Text earlier this year. So we might hear a little bit about that. But she's also co-authored a book with Astrida Neimanis called How to Weather Together, Feminist Practice for Climate Change, and that's published by Bloomsbury. So this book is also available in the UNSW Library catalogue if you're interested in having a look. And there's a whole series of launches that are happening. So there's a launch coming up in April in Sydney, I believe. So maybe we can share those details with you. Yeah, so Jen is also the 2026 convener of a grassroots community transition organisation called Sustainable Living Armidale, and curated a group show called How to Weather Together at New England Regional Art Museum, which opened in November of last year and recently closed in February. So what I find really exciting about Jen's work is that it's really grounded and very local, but also kind of expansive in its thinking. So I really kind of love the way that both Jen and Astrida are kind of experimenting with these quite playful lo-fi methods of climate change adaptation from a really kind of feminist embodied perspective. So I think without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Annie. Thanks for the invitation. I'm super grateful. And yeah, lovely to meet you, Deborah, and be part of this Salon series for your lab, and to see you again, Bronwyn. And thanks everyone also for coming along today. It'll be great to hear from you in the chat. Yeah, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Anouan country, and that the custodianship of the land up here is shared with the Dunghutti, Gamilaroi, Gumbaynggirr and Biripi mob, that sovereignty over the land and waters was never ceded. And that, I guess, obviously I say acknowledgement for very, like regular reasons, but also for me, trying to figure out how to live and work differently in the context of a settler colonial state with a commitment to Indigenous sovereignty is like an ongoing part of my work, and I'll talk a bit about that today. So I'm going to start with a bit of a body-mind practice. If you don't mind switching the slide. I've had all this tech issue, so thanks, Annie, for being my slide person. We call it cosmic weathering. And I just want to say the talk today is drawn largely from the book that Annie just referred to, How to Weather Together. And so when I say we, I am talking about myself and Astrida Neimanis. And I do actually get a bit of my own voice out in this reshaped talk. But yeah, there is a lot of kind of collective thinking in here. So I just want to acknowledge that collaboration and the co-thinking that shapes this talk. Yeah, okay. So, and the book actually isn't out in Australia yet. It comes out in 7 days, which is super exciting. Okay, so in the book, we refer a bit to meditation practices, which may or may not feel okay for some people. I'm happy to discuss this later. But one person we quote in the book is he calls himself a meditation proliferationist, and he defines practice in a really neat way. This is a guy called Jeff Warren. He defines practice as a habit you choose, which I really like. It's a super simple formulation about what practice is. But feminist practice for climate change is about sort of processes of cultivating intentional habits that have sort of both, I guess, individual and embodied, but also kind of social and political implications. And practicing meditation is about habit. So we sort of appropriate a meditation practice as one of our feminist practices for climate change. So just to start, I invite you to, if you like, get comfortable and close your eyes. But I just want to preface this, that if this doesn't feel right for you, If going into your body doesn't feel at all safe, like you can just kind of watch this as though it were a performance of mine, not something that you're participating in. But and it won't be very long. But if you feel okay, please just kind of put your feet on the floor and close your eyes and settle in to where you're sitting. Take a deep breath in and out. And in and out. And to whatever extent feels safe for you, start to direct attention to your body. And if you can, just keep making sure you're breathing. You don't have to force the breath, just let it come naturally. Can you sense the edges of your body sitting in the chair, sitting on the ground or standing? Notice what part of your body is in contact with the chair or the floor, and feel yourself supported in this connection. You're supported by the ground beneath you and the entire planet. And this little guided practice is about a sensory noticing of the weather, and kind of takes flight into deeper weathers as well. What is the weather of the room that you're in? And how do you know it? Can you feel it on your skin? Sense a kind of temperature of sorts? Can you hear anything you might call weather? And so where is the weather? Can you sense it on your body? How and where is it touching you? Is it in your hair, in your hands, in your gut or your feet? And what does it feel like? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it moving? Is it dry? Is it damp? The weather is in and on your body. If you're inside, is the weather different outside? Now, I just want to take you on a little visualization journey. Start to feel yourself falling deeper into the ground beneath you, through the floor of the building, through the carpet and steel and concrete and tiles or whatever it is. Remember to breathe in and out. You're falling into the dirt, other decaying matter, oxygen, nitrogen, old leaves and plants, insects and worms. The ground archive traces of farming and burning practices of country, at least 60,000 years old. You're supported by this ground. What is the weather here? Can you sink even deeper into the flooded basins of the Pleistocene 12,000 years ago, to waters slowing down enough to deposit gravels, clays, silts and sand in the deep grooves below us 160 million years ago? Breathing deeper, moving deeper. What is the weather? How is the weather of your body connected to this deep time weather? Take one more breath in and out. And when you're ready, slowly open your eyes. Thanks for going there with me. I'm just going to keep going now. So in this talk, I want to sketch the pathway of a 10-year-long project on weathering as a feminist concept, framework, and set of practices for climate change. One of those practices is cosmic weathering. And actually, Annie, if you could flick the slides, I think they're slightly out of order. Maybe it's the next slide. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and so I want to just explain some of the kind of conceptual elements of the concept. And there's so many kind of ways you can cut the book. So I'm just learning about how to present about the book and not try to do everything. I still think I'm trying to fit absolutely everything into this talk. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But I want to revisit the idea of weather and kind of expand on that by talking about unlearning colonial meteorology and the idea of the more than meteorological. And then move from weather to weathering and briefly sort of sketch that concept. Some of you may be familiar with it. And then finally, I go through a few examples of my work specifically as it developed since I moved up here to Armidale. Actually, well, the slide before is the one that I was after now. Sorry, Annie. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge, I already acknowledged Astrida and we co-authored the book. But the weathering concept and all of these practices develops over a larger collective of people. It began in 2015, and we sort of just there was a handful of people in Sydney that were working together and some folks from Canada that were friends with Astrida. And we began experimenting via a kind of methods lab, drawing on socially engaged art, community organising, ethnography, performance, body care, craft, and DIY publishing in order to sort of expand our understanding of the relationship between weather and climate change. And I think for me, one of the driving forces was to try to apply the concept in practice, the concept function for me as a sort of ethical framework and guiding principle. But then the question is what happens when you try to translate that into practice? And the book collates all this. And so when I moved to Armidale in 2018, and Astrida moved back to Canada in, I think, 2021, the Sydney pod kind of dissipated, and it sort of ended up, the Weathering Collective ended up being just really me, Astrida, and Tessa Zettel, our illustrator. But one of our early projects was this weathering map, which we did in 2017 for a digital publishing project called Legend by Chart Collective. But unfortunately, the website hasn't been well archived, so you can't really see it anymore. But it was quite a fun project. All right, thanks, Annie. If you could go to 2 slides hence. Great. All right, so we can only start where we are, and I want to talk about that now because I think it's worthwhile, particularly in the context of what I was saying around the acknowledgement of country. And I have quite complicated feelings about my own inheritance. To this end, I grew up on Tharawal country in Wollongong. Most of you probably know Wollongong, but industrial port city to the south. I have Scottish and Irish and German heritage. And I spent my time as a child inhaling coal dust and swimming at the beach. And my academic starting point, even though the ending point is quite different, I guess, in this talk, is literary studies, which I actually studied at UNSW and the College of Fine Arts. So literary studies, and I did art theory, and I did performance studies and gender studies. So it's always been interdisciplinary and a combination of theory and tech-centric disciplines, and also very practice-led ones too, but nothing kind of in the social sciences really. And just as I finished my PhD, environmental humanities was emerging as a named discipline in Australia, and it was actually at UNSW that program was first seeded. But training with theory, feminist, queer and anti-colonial, and even practice was still very within a Western canon. So when thinking about the weather in the context of my PhD, I was trying to bring this like vital force into a critical language that was still incredibly anthropocentric. And I was reading a literary history where the weather had always been treated as metaphorical. The weather was subordinate and backgrounded to what it could say about the human experience in this context. And this is obviously from a worldview where that connection between the human and the weather is dichotomized. And once you do the work of joining the dots between weather and human, you arrive at a place where everything is connected. But that's not like a hugely original thought. To paraphrase Zoe Todd's critique of Bruno Latour in the essay, the quite iconic essay, An Indigenous Feminist Take on the Ontological Turn in relation to myself, in one sense, I was awarded a PhD as a non-Indigenous thinker for, quote, discovering or newly articulating by drawing on a European intellectual heritage what many Indigenous thinkers around the world could have told you for millennia. And though my thesis and that work, which still is with me today, was more specific, and there was an intellectual question at the heart to be answered around how hierarchical systems of power and governance seek to control the weather, and how those systems are internalized by powerful figures, leading to deep and actually catastrophic struggles with vulnerability, animal mortality, and embodiment that play out on a political stage. One of the key moves in this work was to understand and interpret the literal weather as connected to the socio-political world, which, right, is not unique in Indigenous ontologies. And Astrida has a similar story coming through philosophy and feminist phenomenology within a Western tradition. And I think this kind of genealogy is important because it sort of explains the steps that we go through in the book about realizing in some ways the inefficiency of this starting point. One key activity that is like central to our process now, but took us a while to get round to, is the idea of unlearning colonial meteorology. And this is not a simple process. It's a kind of tangled up in my work now and always will be, sometimes explicitly, but always implicitly. And this unlearning is for myself, but also as a scholar and community organizer, it's about figuring out ways to gently lead unlearning processes in other non-Indigenous folks as part of climate justice work. And I don't think this is simple. And just in terms of my own like social context, I live in the New England, the electorate, which is effectively a One Nation electorate right now. There is a relatively high Indigenous population here, but we also voted 75% no in the referendum, for example. So, you know, it's not a straightforward thing to be trying to seed anti-colonial thinking in such a community. And so, but this process, if you could move the slide, please, Annie, is also not simple for Indigenous people. Actually, the next one, sorry. Thank you. In the poem Learning Bundjalung on Tharawal, Evelyn Araluen represents her own process of unlearning English and learning her own Indigenous language. It's hard to unlearn a language, to unspeak an empire, to teach my voice to rise and fall like a landscape. Due to colonial disruption, Araluen was brought up speaking English and later in life starts to learn her own Indigenous language, Bundjalung from the far north coast of New South Wales, off country in Wollongong or Tharawal country, all the while knowing that language and country are related. And the poem reveals how, due to the impositions of language, unlearning empire is also not simple for Indigenous people. Empire in the second line is a metonymy, a whole that represents a part. To make empire stand in for language reveals their fundamental relation. Our unlearning challenge is not the same as Araluen's, and it's differently fraught, but it's something that I think needs to be at the heart of all environmentally oriented community work in a settler colonial place like Australia. But as I mentioned, I am, like, literary studies is my training. And I think I just want to share a little bit about the theory of language that's at the heart of this, this work. And it feels a bit retro to focus on language, but I think it's important, and I'll say some things about that in a minute. I think maybe the next slide is the one that we need. The iterations one. That's great, thank you. So the words weather and weathering are English words, and English words are only being spoken here due to colonization. And this perhaps is an obvious point worth stating because English has naturalized itself here as a cornerstone of the colonial state to such an extent that we know this history of that this history of meaning of words can harden and come to seem fixed when language really is fluid and a way of getting by and relating to each other and the world and our bodies. The English terms weather and weathering, when we think of the words weather and weathering, we think of more than just thunder, lightning, wind, and rain. And learning literary studies at UNSW in the early 2000s from feminist readers grown up on the post-structuralist, post-colonial psychoanalytic theory traditions of the 80s and 90s at the height of the linguistic turn, the theory that speaks to this ambition to really destabilize the meaning of words in relation to our work is the theory of the sign. And the reason I think it feels important to visit this as the substrate of this work right now is due to the charged political moment where meaning is so deeply contested and frustrations, if not outright contempt for the contest of meaning itself run high. Just think of the word woman in the context of current debates around, like, not debates, but current like moment of transphobia. So like language is, you know, the site of a lot of political frustration. And I guess the reason I'm sharing these theories today is, again, because they're sort of fallen out of vogue, I think, in a lot of curricula, is that this theory of language holds that the contest of meaning is the status quo. We can't avoid this contest of meaning. We'll never arrive at the final meaning of a word. Language is alive in and through our bodies and continues to develop in time. And this theory of the sign, which is Saussure's work, argues that language is mutable, immutable, and arbitrary. And this is that, like, the idea that it's immutable is that it's very difficult to change the meaning and definition of words, but it is possible because there is no innate relationship between language systems and like everything else in the world. And I'm not trying to reinscribe a human nature, like language nature distinction here, but that there is some kind of technical separation that allows for play and allows for innovation. Like it's not baked into our biology. But we're interested in what words can help us think, and also what they actually do in the world. And this is an old queer feminist point about performativity, how words do in the world, not just describe the world. And so in this, we're kind of like not just thinking about performativity and how words do in the world in a sort of ethnographic sense or in a literary study sense where you trace it. We're actually trying to enact that in practice. So the practices that we enact are looking at the theory, at the idea of weathering, and we can kind of reform the theory around what we learn from our practical tests. And that revised theory can kind of help shepherd us in the future. So this iterative relationship between theory and practice is key. One doesn't necessarily come before the other. Also, I just think it's important to note that in the kind of contemporary, like normative Australian, I mean, probably global imaginary around weather, like when you think about meteorology, that's often dialed to quite specific concerns around state control. So like colonial meteorology, we might think of as represented in part by the Bureau of Meteorology, this edifice of modern science as linked to the nation state. And so in unlearning colonial meteorology, it's not just unlearning this particular knowledge, but we're grappling with different but related historical erasures. I don't have time to go in depth around all of these erasures that relate to unlearning colonial meteorology, but they kind of all connect with the rise of modern scientism and technocracy, and of course, industrial colonial capitalism, underpinned, I think, by the desire to control nature. The weather is kind of one of those more unpredictable forces. And I'm using the word nature, like I have my critique of the nature culture binary. I'm not trying to reinscribe it here, but kind of nature or the more than human. So that weather is one of those more unpredictable forces of nature, or at least constantly so, even in minor ways. Like, so it's this desire to background and control weather for certain ends is really very strong in our culture. A little fact that is illustrative of this that I think is just good to have in the back of your mind is that meteorological acts are constituted by nation states. For example, the Meteorology Act of 1955 in Australia, and it outlines meteorologists' professional purpose, right? They're not just describing the weather or trying to forecast the weather. They're supposed to predict the weather to best support and defend the state and the economy and certain industries like aviation and agriculture in particular. So the weathering work is like sort of up against that in the sense of we're trying to kind of unlearn and reshape the way that we think about weather against a world that is like structured around the control of weather for particular ends. Also, in terms of this idea of historical erasures, in addition to the sort of Enlightenment period being one where the cultural dimensions of weather were drained from the way that people thought about what the weather was, right? It became background, it became boring. The other erasure is the erasure of Indigenous weather knowledges. If maybe the next slide is the one now. Yes, thank you. And so on the one hand, the draining of the weather's socio-political understandings in English coincides with the rise of modern meteorological sciences and the nation state and all of this stuff. It also is the simultaneous and attempted erasure of Indigenous weather knowledges, as O'Gorman and Beattie and Henry describe in their 2016 paper, Histories of Climate Science and Colonisation in Australia and New Zealand, 1800 to 1945. If colonisation meant making weather knowledge, it also involved erasing alternatives. So in starting where I started, writing in English with a training in literature, seeking feminist, queer and anti-colonial theory and practice to build new relationship with weather, an important part of this is working through the inheritance and holding on to some things like this theory of language that I really love and can't seem to let go of, but also letting go of others, colonial ways of questioning, relating, and knowledge making that constrain us all. So in the spirit of pushing language in new directions, if maybe the next slide. Thanks. We have noticed that in a lot of Black feminist and also health justice work, the word weather is being used to do really interesting things. This work talks about weather in what might seem initially to be a metaphorical register, but when you start thinking about weather, bodies, and like socio-political landscapes, that kind of idea of that separation between the idea of weather as a metaphor for some kind of political experience and an embodied experience really falls away. That distinction doesn't exist anymore. So Claudia Rankine published a poem at the height of COVID in 2021 called Weather, which describes weather as, quote, a form of governing that deals out death and calls it living. And it seems to refer to immediately to socio-political weathers, but elsewhere in the poem, she's talking about like embodied harm. And it's very difficult to, I guess, separate the experience of police violence from like that being on a cold or a hot day or in particular conditions, and the way that that wears down the body over time. Similarly, in her influential book, In the Wake, Black Studies scholar Christina Sharp also talks about anti-Blackness as weather or total climate, while Audre Lorde said, in order to withstand the weather, we had to become stone. And so in each case, there's I guess, a privileging of that metaphoric register in these instances, but also a deep interest in the material effect of those power structures, cultural processes, on bodies. And so there's something instructive here. As soon as we're in the domain of the body, we're in the domain of the weather world. And so the distinction between these different domains collapses. Public health researcher Arlene Geronimus has also been writing for over 2 decades about the phenomenon she calls weathering, that refers to the material impact of racism on Black women's bodies in the US that empirically manifests in poorer health outcomes. And she kind of does all of this really rich work to unpack all of that health injustice. But the work doesn't go into depth about weather and climate change and weathering, you know, and heat island effect and all of that sort of stuff that we might be thinking about in environmental studies. But the weather, she is talking about the effects of these systems on the body. And so the weather is going to be a factor there as well. And so there's no absolute metaphor in this context when we're talking about the weather and its effect on bodies. Weather is always going to be more than meteorological. Like Lord, Sharp, and Geronimus, Rankine's poem suggests that all of this, the droplets of water in a rainstorm, microaggressions in a racist workplace. Sorry, I just saw that thing come up in the chat and I can note it in a sec. Microaggressions, the violence, the resistance, and the actual storms that are storming is weather. And just to say, Virginia, you've mentioned, is it related to body weather? We do in the book have a section on body weather and how it influences this particular work. There's another dance scholar, Jo Pollitt, in Western Australia who does really fantastic work on different traditions of dance and weather as well. So it's related, but it's, I guess, a slightly different discipline and discourse. Okay, so now I just want to go to also talking a bit more about weathering. I think I've probably not got you to skip, like to show some slides because it's just a bit confusing for me. But there is the next section on from weather to weathering. Sorry about, there's some nice pictures in here too. I think it's the next one. Great, okay. So weathering already has meanings in architecture, geology, soil science, and as we saw with Geronimus's work in public health. And we've developed it specifically as a feminist term for climate change because we think it can do 4 specific things that other terms don't do. Weathering as a material process that slowly changes the material structure and composition of a body is something that happens to bodies. Using weathering then is a way of taking a view of climate change as something that happens out there in the atmosphere, represented by climates, like lines on climate graphs, but also bringing it down to the level of our bodies. To use weathering is to insist that climate change is an embodied phenomenon. And that definition really, Astrida and her colleague, Rachel Lowen Walker, in their 2014 article, that's really, I suppose, one of the key ideas in that article. And weathering is about difference. Just as sandstone weathers different than wood, different bodies weather differently. It matters, as Claudia Rankine reminds us, whether you are black or white, rich or poor, when the storm is storming. And that, like, having an analytic that accounts for difference at an embodied level is different to something like resilience, which tries to kind of, I think, as it manifests in policy documents and, you know, urban planning and all that, it's really trying to just get everyone to be quite homogenous. And there's lots of critiques of resilience along those lines. Weathering is also about materiality. Although we have just seen that weather is sometimes used in a metaphorical sense, even still it refers to material processes. The weathering of racism on a body is no less material than the weathering of a body due to thirst and drought. And finally, weathering is durational. Although we have been told many times by many learned scholars that climate is a durational pattern and weather is an incidental phenomenon, in that distinction between climate and weather, or climatology and meteorology, the weathering framework reminds us that weather is also part of longer-term processes. All weather is part of a string of happenings and becomings that make up the total climate. In sum, weathering is how we all in our everyday lives experience climate change. By leaning into the existing meanings of the word, but expanding them to resonate with the processes of climate change, weathering becomes a way to bring our research, analysis, and action on climate change down to the scale of the bodies and communities of bodies. And feminism, I haven't even mentioned the word feminism, I don't think, which is terrible, is also a crucial part of this framework. And it's actually the first chapter of the book, which it'll be interesting to see how that's received. Still trying to do a lot of heavy lifting. But feminism reminds us in the very most basic sense to pay attention to bodies, and also to pay attention to difference in those bodies, white, black, young, old, and that the differences are not problems to be solved. Different bodies and their different capacities to withstand weather are a material reality to be held. If bodies weather differently, then the politics of weathering requires us to notice that difference as we work towards a better distribution of shelter and vulnerability. And this idea of the distribution of shelter and vulnerability is, in the book at least, like a central sort of driving ethical orientation of our weathering work specifically. And I guess just another thing to add to this is that ambivalence is also key. And this is not unilateral ambivalence about, for example, injustice, or radical inequality or police violence. Rather, it's ambivalence about weathering. Weathering is in one sense an inevitable process. It's kind of like aging. It's something that cannot be avoided. As queer archaeologist Dennis Byrne develops in his work, he comes to have quite a positive feeling for sandstone as he observes it weathering in his archaeological work. He says, "I am disaggregating, and perhaps it is that which creates the conditions for me to feel affinity for the stone." So thinking with stones reminds us that all bodies weather, no matter how stony or soft. Weathering is not negotiable, but what we can still negotiate is the terms on which it happens. We don't want to actually be invulnerable or totally sheltered or impervious, but we also don't want the exposed to be more exposed as a result of some commitment to a new type of weathering exposure. So we're interested in this in holding in that space a redistribution of shelter and vulnerability, knowing that everyone needs shelter. Everyone is fundamentally a vulnerable animal, and yet that the distribution of that is uneven. And I suppose just to the reference point for that framework is drawn from Lauren Berlant's work on the commons, where she talks about the redistribution of rest, strength, and enjoyment. And I think ours is sort of an adaptation of that, those three things into the two specific ones that relate to weather and embodiment. So weather is neither essentially good nor bad. A stormy meeting sucks, but pelting rain can also be invigorating in the right conditions. What weathering draws our attention to is the presence or absence of shelter for a body and its ability to get through. This shelter, as we argue, also includes the safety to be vulnerable and to be cared for as the weather sets in. All right, now the final little section. I think I still have time to talk about these examples, don't I? Sorry, I haven't been going through the slides. It's just too abstract and weird from afar. So maybe just to part.
Great. Just tell me when to stop. Is this good?
No, this is good. Yes,
Examples?
and then
Okay.
I will go through my examples because I'm just going to speak freely to the examples in a minute. So I'm sure plenty of you have been aware of the infrastructural turn in arts, social sciences, and humanities over the last few years. And we have a particular contribution to this debate in the form of the idea of, quote, feminist infrastructures for better weathering, which is outlined in a 2021 paper, but also developed further in the book. And while we can use these theories of weather and weathering in our own minds and lives and scholarly work and creative practice, in the context of the bigger applied ambit of the work, infrastructure is what we need to turn our theories into practice at a more sort of social, community, and even potentially political scale. And everywhere in the world, weather is managed and our experience of the weather mediated by massive infrastructures. You might even, I don't know if this is true, it's probably not true, but you might even think of a lot of infrastructure in the world having some relationship with weather management. I feel like I need to do a proper audit of that claim. But things like dams and stormwater drains, roads, seawalls, all sort of buildings, architecture, like infrastructure projects do have a relationship with the weather world, and managing flows of people and goods and really profit, whatever the weather. But our interest in infrastructure comes from social practice theory, which is developed by Elizabeth Shove, among others. And it's a counterpoint to individual behavioralist models of change. So I guess our theory of change in this work is linked to our theory of infrastructure. So Shove and her collaborators argue that we actually need support structures to facilitate behavior change. Like road expansion at the expense of public transport funnels more people into cars than onto buses and trains. So the infrastructure actually determines the practice, not way more than the individual will. And so that is a really important sort of, I guess, standpoint for us, and why we want to do this work in community in ways that can help, like, I don't know, like shift practices, not in a way that's moralizing or judgmental or prescriptive, but is kind of facilitated through the creation of infrastructures. And this work on infrastructure also draws on Berlant's notion of infrastructure as something that manages the terms of transition. So it really helps to like set the tone of the world that we would like to get to through the practices of how you get there. It's not an end justifies the means, like the means are the like creation of the end. And it also the kind of background on the work on infrastructure draws on the community economies frameworks of J.K. Gibson Graham, which kind of allows you to, I guess, validate these small scale activities as economic practices within a broader system, rather than as like, just cute or quaint activities on the side of the real show of capitalism. But the diverse economies framework is like, no, these actually are sort of propositions for alternative economic models that have like, maybe small scale, but very material impacts in the world. And so with, in saying all that, I just want to share my examples, which I think maybe the next slide is one. No. Oh, maybe I'll read out this quote though, actually, sorry. The quote just on the previous slide is from the book.
Sorry, just trying to go back, but it's not letting me.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Yeah, so we offer feminist infrastructure as the support structure for resistance and transition, an alternative way of making and holding relations for a specific reason and duration. We see feminist infrastructure as a kind of bridge connecting the world as it is and the world as we'd like it to be, where differently sheltered and differently vulnerable bodies can relate differently. Thanks, Annie. Okay, now the next slide. I should say that the tech issues I'm having, I'm pretty sure is because my office is like 30 degrees today. Armidale is a high country, like it's 1,000 meters, and historically only had like 15 days on average over 30. And I feel like every second day has been over 30. And the university is not at all built for this type of heat, and they can't retrofit it. And anyway, but I appreciate Annie kind of holding the fort in that regard. Okay, so the community weathering station is a little, it started as like a drought project in 2019. I moved up here in 2018, didn't have like a community of artists to work with in Sydney anymore. And my question was kind of like, well, how can these ideas apply in the new context? And the drought was incredibly bad. You can kind of see the ground is like parched. Like it is actually a fairly green city, or historically was a fairly green city, Armidale. And this is kind of around the time that the fires had started burning in September of 2019. And I just noticed that the discourse around the drought was pretty much avoiding the question of climate change, and really focused on individual behaviour models of water saving, and then also future planning for big infrastructure projects like raising the dam wall. And so I felt like the idea of weathering had a place in the community discussions around how to respond to drought. And I devised this kind of pop-up research outreach stall to solicit people's reflections on water and its place in the landscape and their lives, to share some of the theory. Like I'd have a little library there which had all of the kind of theory books. So, you know, old grizzly farmer men could look at, you know, feminist theory books if they wanted to, and some like water saving gardening tips, like wicking bed demonstration, and really also just trying to kind of give people this concept of weathering to see if it would help them weather the drought differently and more creatively, and maybe in a more kind of collective way. And it was kind of an interesting experiment. Like I did get invited onto a town hall panel with like some infrastructure guy from New South Wales and the mayor, who at the time was definitely an old like farmer man, and, you know, the facilities manager from the uni and stuff. And so it was interesting to kind of drip feed the concept into those different contexts. And I still use the stall now, even though the drought has broken, for a whole range of reasons. It's something that I really enjoy. And obviously there's humor at the heart of it, like cows. You know, we're surrounded by beef cattle farming properties up here. And obviously that's kind of central to dispossession of Indigenous folks up here is agricultural enclosure. And a lot of the families who live on these properties are from like squattocracy families. Like they've inherited the land that their ancestors like literally dispossessed Indigenous people to and maybe murdered Indigenous people to take. So it's right kind of at the surface of the culture and the landscape, and there is no kind of going around the cows to really solve the problem of like climate change and transition up here. Like you have to somehow integrate and like be able to talk to farmers and property owners and, you know, potentially quite right-wing climate denying people. So cows was like an attempt to sort of get this as part of the discourse up here. Obviously, I haven't like changed the political landscape very successfully, but, you know, we can only try. Okay, the next slide is the exhibition I did. It's a bit of a slideshow now. Over the summer, I curated an exhibition, How to Weather Together, obviously the title of the book, which was a group show that included, actually the next slide's probably a bit more illustrative of the insets. We printed them at Bad Press in Glebe, which is where the launch is going to be in April, and Tessa Zettel hand-coloured them. And so the insets that are in the book were turned into this art book and put on display. There was interactive practices that people could participate in, and then a range of other artworks that sort of complemented the ideas. And like, I think it was a really popular exhibition because it was on in a public gallery that was free to attend. It was an air-conditioned space, so you could actually go in the middle of quite a hot summer and, you know, spend some time there watching, interacting, just being. So I was quite proud of how that all shook down. And then another example of a project is the next slide, which is still, I mean, like the Cows Project still kind of ticks over. This Armidale Climate and Health Project still ticks over. It started because a local GP who works in Aboriginal Health Service attended this Weathering Everything symposium that Astrida, Tessa and I put on up here when I first moved here. Well, actually, it was just before the pandemic, like it was like the start of 2020. And then she sort of approached me and was like, oh, do you think we could do a climate and health project up here? I work for Doctors for Environment and Aboriginal Health Service, and she was on Doctors on the Front Line. She'd sort of tied herself to certain types of infrastructure for in her scrubs and everything. And the dean of the health school at the time was super keen to support it, and so we got a small Adapt New South Wales grant to run a bunch of workshops. The weathering concept was at the heart of it because we were wanting to think about really planetary health principles, like how to design community-scaled activities that improve human health, also improve environmental health, and in some way draw on Indigenous knowledge and give back to Indigenous community. And yeah, there's a lot more to say about that project, and it's definitely still a work in progress. But it was a really interesting pilot series of workshops that we did, and it's kind of landed in a place of trying to support agricultural transition and also land back initiatives. And I think my work with Sustainable Living Armidale is going to feed the next phase of this through a series of community meals that we're designing and trying to use community economies frameworks to really map small scale infrastructural change that might happen on account of these meal events. And finally, I just wanted to, I don't know why I need to say this. I probably could just leave it there, but this paper that I wrote for text at the start of the year is a kind of a new turn in my work. And maybe I wanted to mention it just because I'm trying to test out how it sounds talking about this in a scholarly context. So Modes of Thermoregulation is really exploring that embodied weather and how you feel, like it's a memoir piece, like feelings about weather and how our identities are kind of shaped by concrete and weather in strange ways, and the options for resistance are limited, particularly in the city, but that there are options, and that thinking about ways of living in a more kind of grounded, in a kind of cooler, slower way, is kind of liberating, but it's challenging. And it's challenging in a society that kind of really privileges speed and fastness and integrity and not integrity, intensity and ambition. And so the reason why I kind of wanted to just drip this in at the end is, as part of this work, and also part of, I guess, a sense of maybe despair about the state of the university, I started a diploma of Shiatsu, an East Asian medicine, which is providing the most extraordinary education in a really established way of understanding the body that is deeply connected to weather cycles, seasonal cycles, and a kind of theory of health and well-being that is also linked to seasonal cycles, and understands heat both as all sorts of weathers have potential for kind of regulating and balancing functions on the body, but also a kind of pathological and dysregulating functions, and also that heat and cold can get stuck in the body in different ways, and that's connected to our emotions. And so it's just a really quite beautiful framework that I'm interested in the years to come to figure out how it might connect up with all of this weathering work in the past. But it does feel like maybe premature to even talk about. But I just wanted to put it there just for my own kind of edification, that it is part of what I'm doing right now. It's not just a side project that doesn't relate to any of this stuff. All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to chatting more.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was great. So we've got half an hour to chat. I'm just checking the chat. But does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Deborah?
Sorry, just unmuting. So noting down a few things. Oh, thanks so much, Jen. Really loved hearing about your work, learning more about it. And I just have, well, I don't know if they're more comments that's about ideas that I had as you were talking, because you obviously covered a huge range of things, which is fantastic. Just going backwards, so the shiatsu and the way that you're talking about the sort of interactions of kind of bodily forces and in relation to the weather and the natural world in which our bodies are situated, made me think about, the humoral model of medicine that, of course, dominated Western medicine from Galen right through to Victorian times, really. So yeah, I was just making some connection there.
Could I actually say something off the back of that just really quickly, because it's something that I didn't mention. And I think, I'm not sure about humoralism. I think it's probably been, well, it's just not used anymore. But there is the science of thermoregulatory physiology. And I had this amazing encounter nearly 10 years ago with Ollie J, who's a thermoregulatory physiologist over at UCID, where he does incredible work on embodied difference in relation to weather. But the goal of his work is productivity in the workplace. So it's how do we cool the worker to make them as productive as possible? And I just have this question around that, what are the pathways out of that trap, which is kind of a heat trap as well, right? We keep trying to figure out ways of cooling the worker to keep the work going at the same speed. And so for me, Shiatsu and the East Asian medicine that I'm learning, which does have an empirical basis, it is, you're able to claim private healthcare rebates, it's recognized by the Australian government as a complementary medicine with some evidence base for effectiveness. Actually kind of proposes alternative ways, which are actually about really slowing down, really being kind of present with what's going on in your body, which is an antidote, I think, to that productivity model of contemporary thermoregulatory physiology geared towards productivity. I mean, it's geared towards well-being and occupational health and safety, which I'm all for, but yeah, the speed thing I think is a problem.
That just sets off a whole lot of ideas in my mind too about this whole productivity thing, and the colonialist and imperialist mentality about how the white man, usually called it that in a way, going to the tropics and finding that their physiology is completely stuffed up by the heat. Or I've been watching this great show on Stan, I think, called Terror, which is about the history of the Victorian explorers trying to find a way through the Northwest Passage in the Arctic.
Oh wow!
And about the and contrasting the local Indigenous ways of dealing with that extreme weather versus these Victorian explorers who, of course, felt themselves as having mastery over the weather, and in fact finding out no, because actually both crews of both ships disappeared. Assumed dead. Anyway, so but it's I really recommend it, because it's based on a book, but it's got this almost sort of spiritual notion of what it sort of speculates about what killed these white men. And there's this image of this polar bear, which is also a spiritual kind of Indigenous entity as well. It's not quite a polar bear. It's also this sort of quite dangerous entity that builds on Inuit knowledges. So yeah, anyway, that's really interesting. And also, did you know that Canberra was founded where it is because it was decided that the climate was because it had proper seasons and got cold, that was considered to be more productive for the legislators and lawmakers and politicians who were there.
I didn't know that about Canberra.
Yeah, well, there you go. So, I mean, that's just,
Yeah, that's neat. I mean,
talk about white man's productivity and climate and weather, and heat and cold. Anyway, just moving on. I mean, because, what you've said is just sparked so many ideas for me. Doctors for the Environment. So there's a fantastic colleague at UNSW. You mentioned, collaborating with a local GP, I think you said that she was.
Yeah, I should have mentioned her name. Her name's Sujata Allen.
Okay, yeah. So there's a local, I mean, I've been involved a little bit with the Doctors for the Environment, and there's a great person who's at UNSW who's part of that and leads that. And they recently published a report on the mental health impacts of heat. So you might be interested in that.
Thanks.
And finally, just throwing a whole lot of ideas out there, just in thoughts and that were provoked by your talk. Finally, on infrastructures. So we're doing, as part of our work with Bronwyn and I, as part of our work with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, we're looking
What was it?
So it's a really long title. ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. So
yes,
Bronwyn's a postdoc working with me. I'm a chief investigator in that.
Yeah, that's
And
must be Centre of Excellence. So it goes across, like, I feel like, is that person from, it started at QUT? I'm trying to think of who that.
It's led through RMIT.
RMIT, okay.
Yeah, there's 9 different nodes. QUT is one of them, and UNSW is
UNSW. Okay, yeah, no, I have heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Bronwyn and I are doing a project looking at the environmental impacts of generative AI.
Oh, wow.
Now, this is where you bring in infrastructure, because we're talking about data centers. We're talking about undersea cabling. We're talking about e-waste that are all, being ramped up big time in relation to the current sort of, big tech quest for profit from generative AI. So that is where I would not call those infrastructures as being anything related to actual weather, but of course they have massive impacts on the environment in terms of fossil fuel emissions, and fossil fuel use for energy and water use. And there's already more than 270 in Australia, and plans to build more and more of them, including in rural regions. So anyway, just a few.
No, I mean, that's a great point.
There.
I guess I want to just say I think they are related to actual weather, and this is kind of why I was like, I need to work more on this point, because it's like, it's about keeping, like, I don't know how the data centers are structured, right? But it's like the architecture would be about keeping all the electronics dry, like it has to be impervious. And yet it also needs all of that water. I don't even really understand how that works. You guys probably do, but like all of that water. So you need to have like the dam and this impervious building. And so there is a relationship with weather there that's like about making sure that the data center can kind of continue in all, like probably heaps of air cons required, like for heat waves and all of this stuff. So I think there is a relationship with weather, even if it's not like in that really literal sense of like stormwater drain.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, what I mean is they weren't set up as a way of dealing with weather.
Yeah.
They, like a stormwater drain is obviously, but they are.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. They totally. That's why they require so much water and so much energy to keep the silicon chips that in the data servers within the hyperscale data centers cool, because otherwise they don't work. Yeah. So that's why they use up so much energy. Actually, is because they have to deal with the weather conditions, and that is why they're being built in places like Greenland, cold places, actually. And there's even been talk of them being built on the moon. Would you believe it?
I mean, I would believe it. Like,
yeah,
I
well, okay. Yeah, I know, but it's crazy talk. It's crazy talk.
Yeah.
But yes, they're often built in the most beautiful, unspoilt regions of the world, because of yes, you're right, in terms of the weather conditions there and where you can keep things cold more easily.
Yeah.
Like Greenland. So,
I'm glad.
Just throwing all that out there for you.
Yeah, it's so also interesting. Thanks for sharing all that, Deborah.
Yeah, no worries.
Could I just add one tiny thing to that? I really think that what you mentioned, Jen, which was also comprehensive and generous as well. But picking up on what Deborah said, I think it's really interesting, that concept of the shelter and vulnerability you were talking about, because as we were just saying, as Deborah was saying, the data centers are having this like care and sense of shelter and vulnerability for these extreme technological of solutions, and they're all being built around that. So I think that weathering frame of the idea of shelter and vulnerability really, really illuminated something for me in terms of that thinking beyond my own kind of personal version of what a weathering body might be. So thank you so much for that.
Oh no, that's really interesting. My gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
The vulnerable little silicon chips, which they are in like literally, but then who like loses out? Like when all the water's used to and energy is used to protect them.
I've also been thinking about the way that, because I was based in Sweden for a long time and I'm a Swedish citizen, the way that the north in Sweden is full of these hydroelectricity infrastructures that also then literally power the south, but also silence all of these waterfalls. And there must be some kind of correlation between this, the silencing of those waterfalls to the using of the within hydroelectricity systems, and then also now we're having with these data center booms. So anyway, I'm not sure if that's actually connected, but I do think they all come together in that infrastructure question.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting.
I think
Virginia's got their hand up. Yes. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
No, that's great.
Oh,
all good. Wasn't sure the etiquette, so I just put a hand up until it was time. Kia ora, Jen. It's so nice to see your face. I've been in touch a few times via email.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I've just started at UNSW with Charlotte Farrell. So
oh, have I not replied to your email?
No, you've replied to my emails. We've talked before. You probably just get lots of fangirls.
No.
Yeah, big fanning. I think it was Richard Orgis and Val Smith who actually originally put me in touch with you like years ago, because they do bottom methodology in Tamaki Makaurau. And they were like, there's people working on compost in Sydney. And I'm like, is there?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I do, yeah. So your work is so cool. And I was just starting the body.
Yeah.
I was just starting the body year. Sorry, not yet. I have to fulfill some thesis bullshit because Australia has more strict rules about that than literally 5 other countries, which is fine because it's free for me to study here, unlike everywhere else. So thanks, Australian government, for your rigour and your money. So I had a couple of questions, just sort of semi-related but not. I'm trying to, for people who don't know, can't tell from my accent, I'm Astrida, I'm from New Zealand, and I'm trying to situate my research in Māori Indigenous practice, but obviously being in Gadigal land mostly, and trying to not be a white bitch and trying to decolonise whatever that means. I'm trying to learn about what indigeneity means here and what the colonial project in New Zealand, in terms of a culture of forgetting and a culture of belonging for white people or Pākehā, is the earning your right through rural farming. New Zealand is a farm, right? New Zealand was the farm. And I went to a talk the other day and maybe it was Liz McMahon was talking about the colonial project in Australia being more of a transformative thing because historically you were convicts and you came here and I don't know, and it's a joke around the world about, you were all criminals and you came here for rehabilitation and she talked about the colonial project as an urban transformative process. And I was like, that's so interesting because I'm here to work the land, I'm here to work the whenua, in Aboriginal and country for me. And she was like, no, it was urban. And I was like, okay. But I'm really interested to hear, I know there's a really long way, and so what I'm going to ask is that you went from a composting feminisms and environmental humanities practice in Sydney, obviously urban, to an anti-colonial practice in New England where you were talking about the agriculture and the stealing of land and the farming. And I guess I wanted to know what your perspective on that shift was, like the rural versus urban nature of Indigenous practice or anti-colonial, decolonial practice as a white person.
Yeah, that's a great question, Virginia. Liz McMahon was one of my teachers in undergrad, so that when I referred to who I learned all of that theory from initially, I was thinking of her among other people. Yeah, look, when I had my job interview here, I got this question, which was, how will your research transition to the New England? And I was so blindsided by the question. Of course I should have prepared for it. And I honestly said, like, I don't know. And I thought that would be, I was probably more articulate than that, but that was the basic gist of my answer. Like, I don't know what it's going to be like, but I'm committed to place-based work and site-specific work. And, moving to a regional institution, it's very different working in a regional institution where it's the only university nearby. The university in a place like Armidale is absolutely, like, the town is dependent on the university for its sort of economic stability. There's a phrase up here which is like, if the university sneezes, Armidale catches a cold. And then also, so there's that relationship, which to me feels really important. And I guess, like, because I'm a scholar that sees myself as like having a vocational responsibility to the community, particularly in this day and age when the jobs are so thin on the ground, it's like we've got to be doing that work. Like, to be up here and doing the work up here, not working remotely, like being in community. Then there's also, that feels a bit different in Sydney because the universities are so much bigger, they're so much wealthier, there's so many of them. Like our chancellor till just maybe a year and a half ago was from a farming family that bequeathed the land for the university, and his ancestors would have dispossessed Indigenous folks to take the land for here, right? So it's like I was saying in my talk, it's right on the surface. And that, I guess, that surface effect is really important too because of density of population and the scale of development. So even though country is absolutely alive in a place like Sydney, like Gadigal country, like when you're down in the CBD, the water is still all under the city. It's not like countries only outside of the city. But it just, you're able to sort of relate to it differently and kind of in a more, maybe in a slightly more lively sense in a place like Armidale. There's probably more to the answer. Like, I think it's also about the communities of practice, or like who you work with and where you work. So for me, that experience of working in Sydney, it was very much working with, and this was great, I loved it and I miss it, but like artists and academics in the inner city on these ideas and kind of like sharing them with each other and with a public, but a public that was very sort of self-selecting in a way. And out here, like doing the community weathering station stall, I do sometimes feel like I'm a bit out on a limb and like a total weirdo. And I love that. Like I sort of love, like I felt more alive in myself and kind of more at the edge of something up here for that reason, not because I'm super edgy, but just it's like putting this work in that context that feels like potentially there's more potential for a bit of rupture or a bit of change. And, I don't really track it. It's impossible to track. I'm just not the type of researcher who can really track it, unless if someone wants to tell me how to track it, that would be awesome. But yeah, I don't know. That's probably a meandering answer to your question, but it's something I think about a lot. And I do, in one of the chapters in the book on cows, I write a little bit about that as well.
That's cool. I love a rambling, because I was a roundabout rambling question. My other question is very quick. So if you're doing a book launch in April, do we pre-order your book online or do we buy it at your launch? Which is better for you?
At the launch. I'm thinking at the launch, and it'll be 40% off.
Well, I mean, I just want most of the money to go to your pocket. So if you end up with a collection,
I know it won't go to my pocket. I'm just buying the books and I'm going to sell them at the same price that I bought them for.
Beautiful. But if that, I'm just always like, can I buy directly from the artist? Okay, good. Because sometimes pre-ordering is good because then you make the bookshop order them.
Yes, that is cool too.
But you would rather I can buy the launch. That's fine. And you're doing it.
Hopefully, right. Hopefully. Thanks,
it's fine. I'll save my money. It's great.
Save your money, yeah.
Great. I have a question that is maybe slightly related to Virginia's question. I'll just jump in quickly because I'm conscious that, we've got 10 minutes and maybe other people want to ask you questions. But I mean, in terms of like having those conversations, and I mean, you spoke about unlearning, colonial meteorology and maybe sort of gently leading other kind of non-Indigenous people at the same time as, having conversations with farmers that might be on a very kind of different end of the political spectrum. And you also kind of spoke about, I guess, drip feeding these ideas. And I kind of wondered about like whether you have a method or you've developed a kind of method or an approach or just what what those conversations are like, because yeah, this idea of drip feeding also makes it sound like you are being tactical or subtle, or there's like an element of patience or perseverance. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about those conversations you're having and what you've kind of learned over time.
Yeah, I love that question. And also I feel like it's a bit of it's something that I could be more rigorous about in the cows context. And I guess this is sort of like I never did scale up cows. Like my DECRA that I wrote a couple of years ago, or however many years ago, was about trying to scale up cows as this method. And I developed like a more rigorous method around doing that work to capture data, but I didn't get the money. And so I never kind of did that piece of the work. And I actually can't exactly remember how I mapped it out. And maybe partly why I didn't get it was because I didn't refine it as a sort of social science data collecting method. It was still working as a like pop-up, socially engaged art type stall. But I think this idea of drip feeding is like, there is a subtlety to it in that it's very political. Like this work is so political, like it's queer feminist anti-colonial ethos at heart, and like I don't really want to compromise on those things. But if I had a stall that said like queer feminist anti-colonial climate change info tent, like maybe I wouldn't get anyone coming up to me to talk. And so I think like the community weathering station framework is designed with exactly what you were talking about in mind, Annie, like patience, like subtlety. Yeah, I definitely think strategy to try to like bring people into the conversation. And like, though I've been a bit more low key about it in recent years, I would say, but during the drought where I had really like obvious activities that people could do, like all sorts of people would show up. I remember one conversation, it's sort of the one I like when I was like, I really need to be capturing these conversations somehow, but I didn't. And so it's not really research data that I can use, but like this lady was like, oh yeah, like this drought, like my sister-in-law, she's crazy, you know, she believes in climate change, but maybe she's onto something, you know, like just like she was just thinking it through out loud in the context where that conversation could come up, not being told what to think in that like sort of political stall sense, but like invited into the reflection in relation to the context. And I felt those shifts happening. But yeah, I think methodologically it's difficult to, and maybe all creative practice like researchers come up against this a little bit, like once you formalize the method and have the form with the sign off, you know, to collect the data, you do sort of somehow disrupt that authenticity of engagement. And I think for me, I've managed to do the work without having to turn it into an official data collecting stall. And to me, it feels in some way more transformative, but it's harder to, I guess, fund at a different scale. So if I do want to ever scale it up, I probably will need to like think more on this question you've just asked and how to formalize that aspect of it.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting because it makes me think back to what you were saying about infrastructure as well, and the difference between a kind of, you know, infrastructural theory of change versus something that's like individualist or willpower. But it's kind of just gently kind of giving people the prompts and the space in order to think differently or to have that conversation in quite a, you know, non-coercive way, you know?
Yeah.
So
and actually there was a stall, I think there's some stalls, yeah, like more stalls are kind of popping up in Armidale, and Blanche Verley from UCID is part of this, oh my God, what's the organization that she worked for called? Climate for Change, I think the organization is called. And they put out a card deck, the Climate Conversations card deck. And actually the stall next to mine the other day had the deck. And I sent Blanche a photo and she's like, oh my God, I haven't even seen the deck of cards yet. And so it was cool that it showed up in Armidale, and like, yeah, like it's also a really neat method for starting conversations, because it was more of an opening than an information exchange.
Awesome. Does anybody else have questions for Jen?
If I'm not cutting anyone off, I've got a tiny question for us to end on, maybe. But is anyone else wants to jump in? I was just wondering, Jen, if you had anything else you wanted to say about planetary health, because I think it's a very interesting concept, and obviously it comes out in your work with the Armidale Climate and Health Project. But is it something like, is planetary health like a kind of theme throughout the book, or is it something that just exists within those very health specific things, or do you see it as part of your broader work?
I do see it as part of the broader work. There is a chapter in the book. So the book sort of has this like theory practice structure, even though we're trying to get it to be iterative, like I mentioned at the start. And the last 4 chapters are like single author chapters. So Astrida has 2 chapters and I have 2 chapters. And one of my chapters is called Downscaling Planetary Health. And it's like sort of a case study chapter on the Armidale Climate and Health Project. And it talks about, I think, how that project came about and how the weathering concept like helped to shape a sort of local articulation of planetary health concepts. And sort of, I mean, in some ways, like the work of Armidale Climate and Health Project is on a very similar scale to Community Weathering Station, but the goal is to try to arrive at some idea of what like health is at a planetary level and at a local level. And I think I'm like, for me, like both of these projects are still absolutely ongoing. Like even though they've been collected in the book, both of the chapters are like, you know, it's just a slice of it. And so it really just narrates that first Adapt New South Wales grant and all of the work we did as part of that, and then just describes sort of where I've left it and where I'm up to with it, which is around this community meals work. But that's still provisional, I think, like, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for like meals as an event, I guess, because I'm doing these like small scale like community events as one of my primary methods, to bring in a lot of different things. Like if you have try to create meals out of like sustainably farmed produce, and you document that, you can actually sort of see potentially even measure like health returning to like the landscape. Maybe not in an anti-colonial sense in that context, but you have that one little piece. If like one of the people that I'm trying to get involved in this project, but I haven't succeeded in securing yet, is a nutritionist who works at Healthwise in Armidale to help kind of inform like information about menu planning. So it's like really thinking about what constitutes a healthy meal, but then also I guess that kind of social connection that comes from sharing a meal with people kind of mitigate some of the like mental health crises that come with all of this. And kind of trying to measure how that, like, I don't know, measure, like, it'll be on a small scale. It's not going to be like a big quantitative, like, planetary health study, which is often done at such a huge kind of epidemiological scale. But like those micro, like little transitions that can kind of happen in that context. That's sort of where I want to go with that. Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. So fascinating. So
There's
cool.
something so lovely about the integration of food and produce and locality. In tikanga Māori, we call it manakitanga, when you feed people, because a community event people must be fed, and the idea that it's so closely connected to land, because what is in the land goes in the belly, and what goes in the belly is what goes into the land, and you talk about a nutritionist, but what are the Aboriginal, what are the Indigenous Australian connections to food seasonally, production wise, and in terms of hosting, because the idea of Māori not feeding you is like you don't do it. It's like you wouldn't even not do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, just to add, like I I did last year, it wasn't really part of my research, but Gabby Briggs is a Anawan artist who lives in Nam, and she has some really amazing video works that she came up to Armidale to show for the first time back on country. And I catered for that event, trying to pilot the community meals method a little bit. And but she was just like, I absolutely have to have a feed at this event. Can you do it? And I was like, sure, you know. And I think that relates to what you were saying.
Yeah. Like it's just like a no-brainer. Like it's if you but it's so tied into the locality of land and there were, I mean, I'm veering into like not question territory, but when I lived in Otatahi for 5 years, and there was something really wonderful about 90% of your food could come from Canterbury. And my colleague's sister-in-law ran the major venues there, and her major overhaul for like town hall and convention centre, and was all the catering food must come from Canterbury. It must. And suddenly there's millions of dollars being pumped into local economy simply because one woman said, I want the food to be local. And for me, what does that say nutritionally and spiritually and mentally, not just economically, that the food you are consuming comes from where you are, and indigenously as well. Yeah. And when you think about planetary health, like, you know, think global, act local is so glib, but is so obvious. And I think there's something in that, you know, like planetary health starts with, I'm eating from somebody down the road. Someone grew this down the road.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm feeding them because I share, because it's community. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Virginia.
All good. Just like eating, mate. And I think there's something very, I think about this too as someone hormonally imbalanced and struggling with heat in Sydney on a like a minute by minute basis. Like, what is it for your body to be weathering dysregulated weather, and how do you know, and that food and agriculture and produce is so locally demanded by the weather, and what is it, you know, if the food is dysregulated, if there's a storm and the food's fucked, what is that doing to the body seasonally or whatever? Those things impact this body as well as our bodies, and as well as the food source. Yeah,
agreed.
So thank you for all the ideas about weathering.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, Jen, thanks so much for being so generous with your time and for seeding all of these beautiful ideas and conversations. It's been, very delicious food for thought, I would say. So.
Oh, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. And it was great to, as I said, meet you, Deborah, and see you again, Bronwyn and Annie.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Really interesting. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Such a treat. Thank you so much for fitting us in to busy schedule, Jen.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, yay. All right. Well, thanks for posting the link to the launch in the chat, Annie. If you're free on the 12th of April, it'd be lovely to see you there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming. We love seeing you at our salons. So yes, we'll be in touch about the next one.
Exactly. It's in May, the next one, May 14.
Okay.
Yay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.